your projection? How do you see people will be actually using data and so to say closing the feedback loop, and that they will be empowered by knowing what's going on and then making demands? And you spoke a little bit about that already. Now, there one is just having the data systems in place, but as we spoke about this morning and Robert presented that, it's also being able to read the data, understanding what it means, and so on. What's your experience? How data literate, so to say, is the population in general, and do you see there are more opportunities than worries, or are there some things that we should be aware of?
Speaking about Nigeria specifically, one of the things we found out during the elections was that the feedback that we got sort of matched Nigeria's broadband map. So obviously where there was greater internet penetration, you had more people sending in data around elections. But I think as that, the government is making a concerted effort in increasing broadband penetration, increasing internet access, and also sort of piggybacking on what Robert said earlier, it got me thinking, if Indonesians are using Twitter and Facebook primarily from SMS platform, it's definitely something we can leverage on, because we have a lot more people who have mobile phones than who have internet access. But we focus really up to date really on those with internet access. I think another parallel, we focused on elections, and we're sort of moving that forward and said, fine, they've gotten elected, now let's start talking about data around allocations, around programs, around policies. What is the sort of around a program that we're calling rights and responsibilities of citizenship. So you can't ask questions if you don't know what you're asking about, and you can't demand if you don't know which tier of government, for example, is responsible for whatever service or good that you want. One of the more active Twitter handles in Nigeria at the moment is one called Giddy Traffic, and basically it helps people navigate traffic in Lagos. For anybody who's visited Lagos, Lagos traffic is, I want to say worse than New York's, but who knows, but it's just ridiculous. And part of what is challenging about it is simply the fact that there's no information. So there's traffic, you're in standstill traffic for 3 hours, and the simple reasoning is, I don't know, maybe there's an accident. Now, if I knew there was an accident when I left to where I was coming from, I would find another route. But there's no radio station that provides information, there's no other way. So people have started now, in a sense, crowdsourcing traffic information. So you see a lot of tweets that get the traffic going, I'm about to leave Finland Hall to City Hall, what's the route, what is my best route? And you just have people sending back, oh, I'm on this route and it's free, or I'm on this route and it's a lockdown. So there's still not a structured way of sort of harnessing that information that either an organization or a government agency can use that and help in terms of mapping or providing sort of concrete data. But right now it's, and I see that developing as people begin to see the value. I think earlier in the year, Nokia partnered with the Twitter handle and is trying to sort of fusing Nokia maps into what it's a Twitter handle managed by 2 individuals. So it's really, it's not an organization, it's not any formal entity. So I definitely see that happening as people begin to see value in information and feedback and sharing. I see that definitely changing.
Thank you. Coming to sort of like the data and the data gaps, and Robert, you spoke a little bit about that, and you recognized, yes, we know that this is not capturing everybody and everything. When you look into the future, where will be this whole system going? And especially I'm thinking of Zenda's question earlier on, where she said, well, are we leaving out the poorest of the poor? Are we having such a bias in this? And then there were some other questions about whether this is, you know, biased towards the urban traffic and so on. 2 years from now, where do you think we will be, and will this become more of a robust, reliable system where gaps are filled, and how do we, you know, deal with those gaps that are there?
As a career technologist, I'm used to hanging out in circles where people say, you know, technology is neutral, but it's not. That is a lie. Open systems, open source software, open data bias toward those who are best positioned to take advantage of them. If you doubt this, if I told you you need to buy a book and you need to have it in 48 hours on your porch, where would you go? Right there. You need to go search for something. Where are you going to go? Google. How many other organizations can build tools like this many, but the quick eat the slow. And whoever is able, and whoever has the resources to move the fastest, to take advantage of open networks, open access to customers, open access to information, is going to become a monopoly. So I think in general, we shouldn't assume that because we make everything freely available, you know, there's going to be a complete even distribution of power. That is certainly not the case. I think that what we can aim for within a 2-year time frame is evidence that this works in ways that do, let's say, broadly promote awareness that people who we traditionally think of as having no voice do actually have some form of input. I think it is possible for the first time, whether it's, you know, citizens actively speaking out through the kind of you know, networks that Yemi talked about, or whether it's simply being able to gather evidence you know, of whether people are benefiting from all of the resources and claims of, you know, committed action. You know, that's certainly possible. But I think ultimately we have to have a very sober view of this. This is not going to empower everyone. This is not going to erase poverty and injustice by any stretch of the imagination. And in many cases, I think it will lead to new kinds of risks. Everybody knows that chat rooms are places for child predators, right? So I was speaking last year at an event in New York, and the Zambian permanent representative stood up and he said, you know, now we have these mobile phones going into communities, and he said, we're seeing SMS being used to seduce kids. You don't even need a chat room, right? I mean, the first, you know, it's whoever can take advantage of these networks and capabilities first who will use them, and in many cases they will use them to ill purpose.
So some very sobering remarks, and we'll probably have to think as a global community of how do we manage that and how do we, you know, ensure that the downsides don't outweigh the upsides. Ken, when you talked about the sort of immediacy of data and your whatever 1 trillion data points and so on, and that was an example where the short-term data is sort of like also telling us a little bit more about the long-term trends. But a lot of the other things that Robert spoke about in the in his keynote, what Yemi spoke about, is normally fairly short-term feedback loops. And then when we think, and we as in evaluating investments or advisory services, we are hoping for longer-term impacts and outcomes. So how do you see this data will help us look at trends, and what are we going to do with sort of like short-term feedback that might signal one thing and a long-term outcome that goes maybe in a completely different direction?
Well, I think that a key is clearly setting up systems. I think that one of the challenges that we've had as evaluators is that we come in a mold where the timing of evaluation is highly stylized. We evaluate at this magic moment, which is called the closing of the project, and the closing of the project typically comes 7 years after the project initiates. So for many kinds of projects, you may have had all kinds of short-term impacts much earlier, after 2 or 3 years, that you'll miss. But also for many projects, you want to know what's going to happen in the longer term. What's going to be the long-term impacts. And here, I think the challenge is working with projects and with governments, with communities, to set up the systems for long-term monitoring. So let me give you one small example. As part of an environmental evaluation, we were trying to understand the longevity of projects that planted mangroves as coastal defenses. So we had a project which planted mangroves in Bangladesh in 1990, and we wanted to know, well, you know, what proportion of those mangroves are still standing? And it's easy nowadays. You can call up a satellite. You just give your credit card over the phone, take pictures at high resolution. But nobody had bothered in 1990 to record exactly where these mangroves were planted. nowadays, simply recording that information would let us know. In the field of in more social field, for instance, when I was in Indonesia 20 years ago, we were interested in the impact of vocational training. Doing tracer studies at that time was incredibly expensive and difficult. Nowadays, since I assume essentially every young Indonesian is on Facebook, it would be easy to do a long-term study of what are the medium and long-term impacts of vocational training.
Okay, thank you. Yemi, back to you. I have a question that comes from a long-standing evaluation experience where evaluators have very often been accused of extractive industries. They go to the villages, they ask people for all sorts of information, they sort of trouble them with long survey questionnaires. Do people feel that they have sort of been used in a similar way by participating in this type of data collection, or has the way the social media, the technology is working, shifted this sort of dynamic in a fundamental way, and people feel more empowered in participating in that process?
I heard a joke a time ago when I was in Nairobi, and it talked about professional, because I don't know what the word would be, but basically professional survey takers in the NGO community. So they know the right questions to answer, basically know what answers the aid agency is looking for. So they've got it down to a science. And quite a number of them also get a stipend, or sort of either transportation or get lunch for coming to sit in a survey or participate in that kind of study. So I think those are the kind of things that add a sense of bias. So you might feel, there might be a sense of being used, and I guess in a sense they also kind of feel that they're using the system. Okay, so you want me to answer questions, fine, I'll do that. I'll get paid and get lunch at the end of the day. I think for social media it's slightly different because it's free. No one is really paying. I mean, I guess there are some, maybe in other parts, that you get paid for filling out a survey, or there's a promise that by filling out a survey you enter into a lottery of some sort, and then you might win a prize for filling out a form or filling out a poll. But if you're giving feedback based on something that you're genuinely interested in, number one. Number two, you actually see it make a change. So one of the things, for example, that's also in addition to traffic, that's in the last 3-4 months happened a lot in Nigeria Twitter space, is sort of crowdsourcing funding for people with life-threatening illnesses. So you get a short blog post and someone says, save Debbie. Debbie has 3rd-stage cancer, you get a picture, you get a story from a doctor, you get a story for family members, you get a bank account information. He needs 4 million naira, $10,000, $20,000 for surgery in India. Now, nobody's asking you, you're not being forced to, but people give voluntarily. So I think it's sort of different from sort of traditionally asking people to fill in questionnaires and feedback on social media platforms, is there's a lot of more free will. And also I think if I take a survey, for example, of a community, a rural community, they might not, you don't give them a report. So you take the survey, you go, you do your analysis, you evaluate the program. Nobody comes back and says, oh, after evaluation, we find X, Y, Z. Rarely does that happen that you give feedback. But for social media platforms, the feedback is almost instantaneous, and you can see, you can see things happen. And that's one of the things we're pushing in terms of governance and development, that if people understand the power of their voices, so if I'm demanding something and that forces a government official to backtrack, to apologize, to change something, then it encourages people to do more and be a bit more involved.
Excellent, thank you very much. I think that's really something very important for us in the evaluation community to take away from this, as we traditionally have a problem to come back to communities and explain to them what our findings all add up to and how that might affect them in the future. Robert, you had a wonderful picture up about in telephone traffic or whatever in New York. These new technologies lend themselves to fantastic presentations, and we all know, pictures worth 1,000 words. The pictures communicate much faster, leave a much more lasting impression on people. At the same time, what's the risk for misrepresentation? I mean, we've had experiences where we had graphics and a diagram in our evaluation reports that get misread and misrepresented, and that causes a lot of pain and trouble. What do you see are some of the upsides and the downsides of this in the new technology world?
Yeah, it's certainly the case that concomitant with the rise of big data, you've had a huge explosion in data visualization. I mean, we're dealing with complex phenomena and massive data sets, and trying to translate many of these signals into something that can ultimately be used by a non-technical expert to make a decision requires a lot of skill, and it's something of an art, and it's something of a science. And certainly, what we want to do is to really learn how to use these signals to tell the truth as much as one can do that. I have a friend who says objectivity is dead, there's only data. But I think one of the advantages of the open data approach is that you open up the possibility of many different ways of making the data tell a story. We have partnered with a group that is headquartered in New York, but they're an organization that has 26 academic institutions around the world as members, called visualizing.org. And they have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of visualization experts, many who are postdocs. It's a very new field that work on challenges. So we've put out data sets. We did a rapid survey using the JAMA platform and asked 90,000 questions in 30 different countries and got answers back in 5 days. Questions on well-being through this massive mobile phone network. And we put the data set out there and then asked visualization experts, technologists, graphic designers to come up with the best analysis. And we got over 50 submissions. We ended up voting on the winner and the runner-up. But I think with these open data sets, you're not necessarily limited to one interpretation, and I think that the power of the crowd makes it possible to open these things up and get lots of perspectives and lots of different angles, and at the same time, empower communities, hopefully, to really bring in their knowledge of context and make that data tell the right story.
Okay, that's actually very interesting to hear that you have an expert group dealing with this, because obviously there is a very interesting amount of work to be done. Maybe my last question, Ken, to round off before we open the floor for questions to the audience, is, and you spoke about that in your opening remarks, and it's very closely linked to this question of visualization, but more with data being out in the open, and everybody can now access the data, analyze it, and present it. And how would the international evaluation community deal with problems when, for example, there is an obvious misinterpretation of the data, or is there something that we could do and put in place in order to prevent some misinterpretation being done, or data being manipulated, sometimes deliberately in a false way, because one has seen certain things going, and they go like wildfire through the social media, so misinformation can be quite harmful. What would you say we as evaluation community could be doing about that?
Well, I mean, one approach would be to try to harness the power of peer review, so that you could have clearinghouse sites in which people rate the reliability of particular reports. We see this already in online journals. And there's a site that I forget that had a clearinghouse for online data sets, and users would rate the quality of the documentation and so forth. So I think that this is ultimately the only way you can go. People will always try to misuse data for their own ends, but if we could set up a reliable place to go to check things, that would be an approach.
Excellent. So with that, I'd be happy to open the floor for questions. I have Bob already lined up here. I didn't know whether we have somebody with the microphone coming around, and like we had, the RCT was the answer to all questions. It's not going to go down this route, hopefully, and at least the speakers at this table have been very careful to balance everything. There are strengths and weaknesses in this tool. One is the strength of having extremely powerful data sets. I thought that having the ability to give feedback to those who provide data is very powerful and will close a gap that we as evaluators traditionally have had. But then there are the biases and the problems about privacy, about how these systems can be used or misused. What I thought was very interesting and in this morning's keynote speech, which might not have come through so much in our discussion right now, is how do we use this information? And Robert made a very powerful point about there's certain information that needs immediate reaction, like the example of somebody in a market shooting people or a certain type of disease manifesting itself. And then there is other data where we see or can observe patterns where we go like, wait a second, we need to dig deeper into this. And this is very interesting for us as evaluators, because when we can already have through existing data analysis some indications that we can develop hypotheses of what has worked or what hasn't worked, and then through our traditional evaluation tools go back out and collect additional information in order to get that depth and get that better understanding. I think then we're using the tool in the right way. The other thing that is important in this context is developing the capacities, one, to do the data analysis, and Osvaldo's talked and asked, do we need evaluation capacity development, and broad-based, including civil society? I think the answer is yes. But also what Robert said in the morning, it is absolutely necessary, and again something where maybe we have been amiss as evaluators, is developing the understanding of data users of what to do with this data. And the example of Indonesia, where they're training people to understand that when they're getting certain signals, how do they get the whole machinery running that they actually respond to that, is very, very important, and something for us as a community to think about in our linkage to policy making and actual change happening on the ground. But let me thank everybody for the very interesting contributions, and thank you for the audience for being here and raising your questions.